All right, legal explorers, buckle up because today we are taking a deep dive into something that sounds a little intimidating. Strict liability. Now, before you think about changing the channel, because this might sound like a snooze fest, trust me, this is one of those legal rabbit holes you don't want to miss.
Mhm.
Ever find yourself wondering, like, who's really responsible when something goes completely haywire,
Yeah.
even if no one's intentionally at fault? You know those "how did this even happen"
I
situations?
think we've all been there.
Right. And those, dear listeners, are exactly the kind of head scratchers that strict liability deals with. And guess what? You guys sent in some seriously interesting legal excerpts on this very topic. So to help us break it all down, we've got our legal pro back in the studio.
Always happy to be back.
Yeah.
Strict liability. It's funny how often this topic catches people off guard.
Right. It's not as clear-cut as someone messing up and facing the music. So what is it about strict liability that makes it stand out from your everyday negligence case?
That's a fantastic question. It really gets to the core of how this area of law works. See, with negligence, it's all about proving someone acted carelessly or irresponsibly. But with strict liability, the focus shifts to the activity itself. It comes into play when an activity is inherently so risky that even if you're incredibly careful if something goes wrong, you're still held responsible.
So we're talking about situations where even with the best intentions and precautions in place, the potential for things to go sideways is just baked in. Kind of like those "don't try this at home" warnings, but with legal teeth.
You got it. Picture it this way. There are just some activities out there that no matter how cautious you are, come with a baseline level of risk that's impossible to completely erase.
So let's get specific here. What kind of activities are we talking about that fall under this abnormally dangerous umbrella? And please tell me my morning commute doesn't count.
You can relax. Your morning commute is safe, at least for now. Legally speaking, what we're dealing with here are activities that create a foreseeable and highly significant risk of physical harm. And here's the kicker, that risk needs to be present even when, reasonable care is being taken. It's not just about some freak accident waiting to happen.
Okay, so foreseeable and highly significant risk.
Mm.
Got it. So we're not talking about your average grocery run. And actually, speaking of things that are a bit more intense, the research you sent over had some pretty wild instances of what qualifies as abnormally dangerous. What were those again?
Oh, absolutely. One of the go-to legal texts for this stuff, the restatement, third of torts, it specifically points to things like storing explosives.
Yeah, okay, I can see where that's going. Storing explosives, especially in a crowded area, even if you're being as careful as humanly possible. Well, that's asking for trouble. What
Yeah.
else?
Another big one is keeping wild animals as pets.
Right, because no matter how much you love and train, let's say your pet tiger, at the end of the day, it's still a wild animal.
Hmm.
Imagine your neighbor's face if they saw that.
Yikes. Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. You might think, okay, wild animals, sure, that makes sense. But strict liability can actually come up with domestic pets too.
Wait a second. Are you saying my super cute, but let's be honest, slightly mischievous beagle could fall under strict liability?
It's possible. Let's imagine your neighbor knows their chihuahua has a bit of a biting problem, but they still bring it to a packed dog park. Now, if that chihuahua ends up biting someone, even if it's on a leash, the owner could be held responsible. And this is regardless of how carefully they were handling the dog at that exact moment. It all boils down to them knowing their dog had a history of biting.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's one thing if it's totally out of the blue, but if you know your dog has a tendency to bite, that changes things completely.
Hmm.
So how does the law actually draw that line between what's an acceptable risk versus what's considered abnormally dangerous?
Well, that's where things get a little more complicated. Courts look at a bunch of different factors to figure out if something is abnormally dangerous enough to trigger this whole strict liability thing.
All right, lay it on me, I'm ready.
So there's this other key legal text, the restatement second of torts. And it actually lists out 6 specific factors. First up, you've got the degree of risk involved. Basically, how likely is it that something bad is going to happen? Then there's the magnitude of the potential harm. Are we talking a minor inconvenience or something truly catastrophic?
So like a fender bender versus a massive pileup, totally different levels of harm.
Exactly. Then we've got to consider if the risk can be eliminated even when someone's being super careful. Some activities, just by their very nature, have risks that you can't ever fully get rid of, no matter how cautious you are. And on that note, is this activity something that's pretty common, or is it something unusual?
Right, because mowing your lawn on a Saturday afternoon, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But setting off fireworks smack dab in the middle of a crowded street, that's another story altogether, even if you're being careful.
You've hit on another crucial point, the appropriateness of where the activity is taking place. Context is key. And last but not least, we have to weigh the value of the activity to the community against its potential for danger.
So it's like a cost-benefit analysis. Like, yeah, fireworks are pretty. Yeah, but are those few minutes of sparkle really worth the risk of a major fire? Or going back to the dog park, are there certain areas where having a dog off-leash is seen as way riskier than others?
You nailed it. It all comes down to weighing these different factors to determine if an activity is abnormally dangerous enough to bring strict liability into the picture. So let's say you're thinking about starting a drone delivery service, but you're a little worried about the possibility of accidents. These 6 factors are exactly what a court would consider to figure out if your business falls under strict liability. Something to think about, right?
Definitely gives you a lot to consider before taking that leap. But if it's all about inherent risk, does that mean there are absolutely no defenses if something does go wrong? That seems a little intense. So let me get this straight.
Yeah.
Even if I'm being super careful and something still goes wrong, I could still be held responsible. If the activity itself is considered, abnormally dangerous, are there ever any, exceptions to that rule?
You're right. It does sound a little intense, but the law does take those what-if scenarios into account. There are defenses to strict liability, and one of the most common ones you'll come across is called an intervening act.
Intervening act. Okay, now that sounds like something you'd hear in a law school lecture.
It might sound complicated, but it's actually a pretty simple idea. Basically, it means that something totally unexpected and outside the defendant's control happened, and that unforeseen event, that's what actually caused the harm. It's like it breaks that chain of causation we were talking about earlier.
Okay, I think I'm starting to wrap my head around this. So give me an example. Let's say I'm transporting a bunch of fireworks,
Yeah.
completely legally, of course, and all of a sudden a crazy lightning storm appears out of nowhere and boom, it ignites the fireworks, causing a massive fire.
Bingo!
Yeah.
That's a perfect example. In that situation, lightning strike being a total act of nature that's impossible to predict or control, that could definitely be considered an intervening act. You were doing something inherently dangerous, transporting those fireworks, but it was the lightning strike, not anything you did wrong, that directly caused that fire.
So even though transporting fireworks in and of itself is risky, that sudden lightning storm, that's what changes the game. Because it breaks that chain of causation. It's like the universe just threw a wrench in the whole thing.
Exactly. It's not about eliminating all risk, because sometimes that's just not possible.
Yeah.
It's more about figuring out whether something totally unexpected, something the defendant had no control over, came along and totally changed the course of events.
Wow, this has been a real eye-opener diving into this whole world of strict liability. So for our listeners out there who might be rethinking their maybe slightly dangerous hobbies right now, what are the big takeaways? What do they really need to remember about strict liability?
The bottom line is this. Strict liability, it's about inherent danger. It's not just about being careless. If you decide to do something that's considered abnormally dangerous, you're held to a different standard. And here's the thing. It's not always easy to know what will be seen as abnormally dangerous in the future, especially as technology keeps changing and what's normal in society evolves. What we think is totally safe and normal today might be viewed as risky and could even be subject to this whole strict liability thing down the road.
Talk about a legal cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Definitely makes you stop and think twice about those harmless hobbies. A huge thank you to our legal expert for breaking down this fascinating and maybe a tad nerve-wracking area of the law. And to our amazing listeners, we always want to hear from you. Head over to our social media and let us know what really stood out to you. And if there's a topic you're dying to explore, send in your requests. We just might choose yours for our next deep dive. Until then, stay curious and maybe think twice before bringing home that pet tiger.